All right. Well, let's get back into it. We've been playing with all of these sort of like big picture ideas of gender theory and all these like large generalizations. But Eve, do you have any examples for us of some of the like more subtle ways that men as default thinking shows up for women?
Yeah, I mean, it is so subtle that I all the time I'm constantly like, "Oh, wait," rethinking a whole entire conversation I had and realizing the different things that came up. But like I said earlier, just the whole idea of like when someone was telling me about their boss and we assumed that it must be a man. Um, there's just a general direction that I think our brains head in, and that's what we have to pay attention to,
Hmm.
and kind of stop that train of thought before it even continues. Um, there's the problem is that there's so many subtle things, like, is it sexist that a guy is opening the door for me each time? No, I don't think it's sexist. I think it's part of the patriarchy, and it's like this, system that's been set up that, that's one of the very small benefits.
Mm.
Um, although I personally started leaping for the door first. For me, that's empowering to
Sure.
be like, "Hey, I can get the door too," and I love doing little small acts like that. So why can't I start breaking down some of those norms? But yeah, there's little things like that where it's like, is it sexism or is it just part of a pattern that we have stayed in?
Yeah, fair to say. There are so many aspects of these ideas that we just repeat over and over and over without really thinking about it. And it just starts to be taken for granted that this is the way it's supposed to be. We did a episode with Forrest Valkai a couple of weeks ago talking about how there are so many things that we just assume are part of our biology and innate
Right,
to our humanity that are really just culture and don't even exist, a couple hundred miles down the road, let alone
right.
universally in all of humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's also a big part of deconstructing from all of this is learning about other cultures, like getting
Mm,
outside of the way that you grew up. Even for me, I grew up in the South. So seeing how they do things just a few states away, or I lived in California for a time, that already expands your mind so much. Nonetheless, learning about cultures from other countries hundreds of years ago, where sometimes they were a lot more progressive than we are even
mhm.
now. There's tribes where they were matriarchal. That was a big thing, and a lot of that has been erased from history. So getting back to that, I think that's a great way to recognize the subtle bits of sexism and patriarchy that we see day to day is by examining new ways to do things and seeing how what we're doing now doesn't fit into that and why doesn't it.
Yeah, I think there's incredible value in travel and in understanding history and just looking at these different worldviews. I mean, I'll be honest. I have a 14-year-old, and I am terrified of the world that he is coming into. And when we were talking to him about going on his first like airplane ride and trying to show him the world a little bit, and he was like, "Why? Why can't I just stay here? Like, what's wrong with just staying here?" It made me feel really, really terrified that he might grow up in a world that is just confined to Texas, to urban
Yeah.
and rural Texas, when there is so many different other ways to be. And I don't think you can even really realize that, certainly not at that age, without having seen more of the world.
Right. We get in our comfort spaces and that's human. That's part of how we survive as well. And I think that's how the patriarchy has um, continued to remain a thing is that it's made a lot of us comfortable. Especially if we're white women. I think it's easy for us to continue perpetuating patriarchy because we've found our place in it and we've stayed in our lane
We're
and
number two.
exactly, we've submitted to it and we found the good things that we get out of it, and now we're starting to realize as we're losing rights that other women have never had. We're finally like, oh well, fuck the patriarchy, when we should have been like that all along and we assisted in upholding it. So recognizing that is a big part of moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still very intrigued by all of the subtle ways that this shows up everywhere. And I know it's hard to define. It's hard to like sit here and list them off. I even preparing for this episode wanted to like put together a list of, hey, is this actually sexist? Is this actually sexist? And I found I couldn't necessarily do that because everything was so subtle in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, and maybe context specific and everything else. And yet I also find myself being almost maybe a little bit allergic to some of the sexism that I see in daily life, things that I think I was pretty much immune to and seemed very inert before I started to deconstruct my faith. One thing that's coming up in particular is my partner has recently started leaving on 90 Day Fiance whenever she's doing laundry or cleaning the kitchen. And I think 10 years ago, a show like that would have maybe made me go, ugh, this is dumb. But now, even just having it on in the background, I am struck by these just universal assumptions among every voice in the show that, I mean, first and foremost, that of course everybody wants to be an American, but also other assumptions like that all relationships are strictly monogamous or that everybody wants to cheat, but you just can't let them. And so many of these toxic ideas are
Yeah.
showing up that it starts to become kind of uncomfortable to even watch. Have you had that experience?
Absolutely. I notice in a lot of these shows, you'll watch like The Bachelor or 90 Day Fiance, Love is Blind. You'll notice that with the women that are, going through something on the show, they're emotional for one reason or another, usually, always, I think, very valid. They'll highlight those moments and portray those women throughout the show that way. They'll show them with tears all the time. And then the few women who maybe don't have moments where they break down, they will villainize them. They will make them the bad guys for behaving how the men on the show will act the entire time, but never be made out to be cold or the villain in any way. And so it's the whole like infantilizing of women. Again, they show the sweet, meek ones that are crying, and they edit it that way. They rig things different ways on these reality TV shows, but it's painting women in these two different lights where they're either like these emotional creatures that are submissive and kind of victims of the situation, or they're the bad guy. And there's not really an in
Mhm.
between. Um they don't really give a spot for anybody in between like they do for men. And that those are some of the little ways you'll see it in pop culture come up over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I don't want to like fully police everything that people are watching. I know that we're talking about quote trashy reality TV
Right.
and that people generally turn it on at least in small part to kind of laugh at these people, and that may be a little bit problematic, but I'm not trying to be a scold about it. But I guess I'm curious about that experience of just feeling like, ugh, do we have to watch this again? Or just being kind of surrounded by these ideas all the time. As somebody who is like still very unaware of and in many ways unaffected by these things, I'm curious what your experiences are like, and if there are songs or musicians or TV shows that just make you go, I can't today. Like I can't deal with that type of bullshit.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think most things unfortunately bring that to
Sure.
mind. I think it's been so normalized too that a lot of times I find myself like, "Man, I love this song," and I'm like, "Oh, this song is so sexist and so terrible. I hate that I love it so much." But we've kind of been conditioned, like that's all we've had. I'm starting to now purposefully seek out media that is pro women, that is,
Mm.
especially things that have to do like songs lately that have to do with women's pleasure, because that was not a thing for years and years. And if it was considered to be like incredibly crass and shocking. Whereas
Yeah, like
men can,
every 2 or 3 years, there will be a
right.
song where a woman talks about enjoying sex, but it's always like a caricature, like it's so over the top and so raunchy that
Yes,
it's more of a novelty than it is like an actual expression, at least in many
exactly.
cases.
Absolutely. And then that snowballs into more toxicity, and
Mhm.
it sucks. But thanks to TikTok, I've been exposed to all these new up and coming artists that are really in touch with their uh, gender fluidity or whatever it may be, and the way that they sing about women and about the pleasure of women, and um, just the feminine gaze is beautiful, and it's so refreshing to have that and to hear it, and I love the cross songs too. I really do. I think that's really necessary, but women deserved all of it, not just in that one category.
Right.
As far as shock value, I love shock value songs. Men get all the shock value songs, and they get the like really nice, cool songs. And most of the like make out songs from the '90s were very much geared towards men and male pleasure. And I feel like now we're finally, getting to see a taste of what it's like when a woman is describing pleasure or happiness or love. And I think movies are trying to move toward that, shows are trying to move toward that. It's still tough, um, even as far as what they're willing to show in sex scenes
Sure.
of men and their faces and different sex acts, and
Yeah,
then
we
women.
talked recently. We did an episode about the Motion Picture Association of America and the just consistent criticism that if a woman moans or even
Right,
makes a facial expression of pleasure, it's like automatically an R-rated movie. When a guy can talk on and on and on about sexual pleasure and these different things, and it's framed completely differently.
right, and that impacts, not just young people, but all of us. Like, we're always taking in media, whether we're trying to or trying not to, we can't get away from it.
Sure.
And I think it impacts us. And I think even more than hearing sexist things, it's the lack of hearing from women. It's the lack of women's voices that slowly kind of erodes and wears away at that equality, because we're not being heard. Even when it just comes to basic things like our facial expressions and we're receiving pleasure, things like that, that impacts all of us.
Yeah. So, how do we go about amplifying female voices and allowing for like a broader diversity of people speaking without it turning into just tokenism and sort of that same like novelty song type mentality?
I That's a great question. I think that you have to do a little bit of seeking out.
Hmm.
I think that if I'm trying to read a book on a certain topic that has nothing to do with being a man or a woman or anything, I purposefully will look to see if there is a woman that is an authority on the subject first. Because I know that she's probably not going to have her voice as uplifted, as publicized as a man in that field. Generally
Hmm.
speaking, if there's an expert and it's a man, they're going to go with that. So I do think you have to do a little bit of actively seeking out. And that's not to say don't listen to any men at all. It's just to say, like, to expand that, because you're going to be hearing from um, cishet men all the time, no matter what. A lot of us can't help it in the workplace and our families and all of that. That's going to happen. But we do have to start seeking out people that don't fit into that category, non-binary people as well, looking for anyone that's going to add a twist on the conversation or come at it from an angle that's not patriarchal.
Hmm. Yeah. What kinds of maybe pet peeves do you have in this space? I like, for instance, I worked at a job working in mental health. A lot of my jobs over the last decade, I have been, if not the only man, one of the only men. And I worked in an office for a number of years with five women, and it would come up from time to time. Periods. People would want to talk about their experiences. People would need to ask for products. I mean, people have periods. People would want to talk about
Right.
periods. And it always really frustrated me that there was this sort of like, oh no, wait, Christy's in the room, or oh, he probably doesn't want to hear this, or oops, sorry, Christy, I didn't mean to say that in front of you. And I can somewhat appreciate where that's coming from, but I also know it really got under my skin. Not that they would want to talk about their bodies, but that they would want to specifically exclude me, or maybe that they would want to protect my poor sensitive ears. And I recognize that that is perhaps the smallest possible problem that we're talking about here, right? Like a largely cisgendered man feeling left out or unprivileged in this way is kind of small potatoes. And I have to imagine that there are experiences like that that just drive you crazy. I mean, is there anything that stands out tonight?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's silly little things like that as well. I was just thinking today about how I often hear men say, "The wife." Well, the wife
Uh-huh.
wants me home at this time. The wife. I have never, and maybe we should start doing this. I have never heard any of my friends that are wives say, "Well, the husband wants me home later on today." And it's some of even my more progressive friends. It's just like how we talk, and it's little things like that that are it's painting their partner as an object, as like this
Mhm.
thing that they and even the whole idea when men say like, "Oh, the old ball and chain," or whatever,
Yeah. "Oh, I hate my
which is
wife. Take my wife, please." Like, yeah.
right, which is a mockery of the dynamic that's actually in society, which is that it is patriarchal. Men have more access to all kinds of things than we do. There's still an unequal footing in our country when it comes to
Mhm.
men and women, and yet men like to play up this whole idea of, well, I answer to the wife, when usually it's because of very normal things like, I have kids at home and I'd like for you to not like leave me alone this
Yeah.
entire time, you
But
know?
we do accept that language. We so normalize the
Yeah,
idea that men are just poor, put upon, struggling creatures
right.
under the oppressive regime of these women.
Yep,
And yeah, it feels like only recently has it been in vogue to maybe not have that be 90% of our jokes on a typical, CBS sitcom.
absolutely. Even the phrase, "happy wife, happy life," I
Sure.
hate that so
What's
much
good for
because
the goose is good for the gander, or
yeah.
he's in his man cave. I mean, all of those notions.
Right. It's implying like, let's just keep her happy and then life will be good. As though it's not worth having like struggle and tension and dynamics there and equal conversation and working things through. It's like, no, just keep her happy and then you can go on and do whatever you want. It's
Get away
that
with it, whatever.
yeah, yeah. There's so much of that that still comes up, I think, in conversation.
Mhm. Well, I know that a lot of us watching tonight, know out grew up in communities and cultures where these ideas were not just assumed, but pretty fiercely enforced. I think it's natural that many of us still carry around a lot of this language and a lot of these assumptions. What would you say to people who are struggling with recognizing their role in all of these things?
If you're struggling, that means you're trying. So
Mm,
that's a really good start. If you can say that it's difficult for you, that means you're actively looking and you're noticing things. So I think that's great. Somebody who's not actively trying is not going to say it's a struggle because they're going to just not do the work. Um, but but yeah, I think that's a great place to start is struggling.
mhm.
It's confronting things. I confront sexism in myself, toward myself, that's just
Sure. Yeah.
that's part of this society, that's how ingrained it is in our culture. It's gonna be uncomfortable, so, get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Mhm. And willing to recognize that this is something that all of us are doing. I mean,
Yes.
I don't care who you are, how many books on like gender bigotry you've written, you're still breathing the same air. You're still participating in this culture, and I think all of us are carrying some of this around. So to be naive to that is a huge part of the problem.
Yep, absolutely.